Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Locals, all of which links can be found in the low bar. So, this is episode 24 of the Church Fathers. Logos and I will begin the dialogue with Trypho, and we start with chapters 1 to 10. So, chapter 1 is an introduction to this whole thing. So, Justin meets Trypho at the Xystus. Now, the Xystus is a portico of a Greek gymnasium. We're not told what city or where this is, because, of course, at this point throughout the Roman Empire, these are going to be everywhere. Trypho has many companions. Trypho explains he's seeking Justin out. He claims that he was instructed by Corinthus, the Socratic of Argos, to respect men in such a garb as Justin. It would be of mutual benefit for us to talk, he said. Trypho introduces himself as a Jew of the circumcision and has lived out his days in Corinth. They both agree that this is the goal of a philosopher, to discover the secrets of God. Trypho asks, why have not most men taken up the call of philosophy? Justin answers, fear and evil living have led to a multiplicity of doctrines in philosophy, and this has led to contradictions, and men neither getting better nor worse, so why take them seriously? Trypho asks, what is Justin's philosophy? So chapter 2. Philosophy is the greatest profession of man and honored by God. There are many schools: Platonists, Stoics, Peripatetics, Theoretics, Pythagoreans. Why are there so many? The great founders of these schools attracted men not their doctrines, but to their personality and fame. Their pupils sought fame in return. The truth was forgotten. Justin first appealed to a Stoic, but soon realized he could not instruct him in divine things. Then he studied under a Peripatetic, but when the former asked for money, Justin left dejected, believing he was a sophist. He then sought out a Pythagorean, demanding that Justin be acquainted with many diverse branches of knowledge before he trained him. Justin, not acquainted with that, left him as well. Lastly, he found the Platonists. Being of great renown, the Platonists trained him in philosophy. He began his journey as a Platonist. And 3, Justin began his conversion to Christianity with a conversation with a solitary man. Justin went to the beach that was quiet and shunned by men as to contemplate philosophy. One day a solitary man found him and inquired as to his conduct. Justin asked what was his business. The latter stated he was looking for lost relatives. Justin told him he was contemplating philosophy. The man asked Justin, what is philosophy and happiness? Justin answered, the knowledge of what really exists, and pleasure is the reward for the endeavor of gaining wisdom. The stranger asked, what is God? Justin answered, that which maintains the same nature and is the cause of all things. The stranger asked, is knowledge of God found through righteousness? Justin answered, yes. Is knowledge of God similar to the knowledge of discrete professions and skills? Justin said, no. What would one expect the account of a new animal, say from India, that one had not yet seen, without either one seeing it for yourself or hearing the report from a reliable source? Justin said, of course not. How can the philosophers speak of God when they have not seen him? Justin replied that the Plato teaches man can see God through the mind alone. Okay, so basically the first part is the introduction to Justin and Trypho. The chapter 3 begins a few chapters where he's having this discussion with a man on the beach. So we'll stop here, Logos. What are your thoughts on these first 3 chapters?
Yeah, when he was asked initially, why is it that philosophies have so many different branches and so few people take up philosophy, I thought Justin's answer was kind of flippant there. I think what's really important is, at risk of sounding too fedora-like, but I mean, this is a problem that I think everybody should recognize. Um, you can have all sorts of different philosophical positions so long as the matters investigated aren't empirical. They don't have any there's no rightness or wrongness to them that you can find out and go, see, look, you were wrong about that. And so if people are arguing about fundamental metaphysics, but fundamental metaphysics should always be consistent with physics. Nobody's going to be wrong about the empirical facts on purpose. You can kind of conjure schools to infinity. And so at that part, I think it was Trypho that was pointing this out, says, there's so many schools. Why do you think that is? The number of schools would be off-putting to people. And so the nature of philosophy that you can't get a definitive right answer like engineering or science is just, there are 2 types of people, at least 2 types of people. There are people that have to have like a definitive, I know this fact, and if there is not one of those on the table, they just get bored and leave the conversation. And there are people like me and you and others that are okay with speculating, and we think there are some arguments that get closer to it than others, even if we're not fully 100% there. I mean, we change our views on stuff all the time, philosophically speaking. So I thought that answer was kind of interesting. In chapter 3, now this is really interesting, and I think you'll think this is interesting as a Christian. So one of the first things that I was asking myself here is Justin answering this as a Christian or as a Platonist? I think he has to be answering this question as a Platonist, because I can't see a Christian providing some of the answers that he provided. So when the man asked Justin what God is, and Justin says, God is that which always maintains the same nature and in the same manner and is the cause of all things. Well, okay, Christians can believe that God maintains the same nature and is the cause of all things, but that in the same manner clause is very, very interesting, because manner is about relationships, right? It's about how things act toward other things in some manner or other. So if God always maintains the same manner, then everything that's about to be discussed in the dialogue after this point is false. So, for example, does God create souls for man? Well, is there some time at which souls don't exist, which is what they're really speculating? Well, if God always interacts with the universe, with creation in the same manner, then there is no time at which there are no souls or no creation or no world, because that would mean that God has some manner to which he acts toward creation at some time, and then a different manner at which he interacts with creation another time. And so that little clause, in the same manner, is actually a really, really important distinction. It's also a problem we talk about today in philosophy called modal collapse, which is could things have been different? People want to say that God has free will, and so God can change the manner in which he acts towards creation via the decisions he chooses to freely act on via his own free will. But if God's constrained in the manner he acts toward creation, then that whole free will model goes out the window. You get modal collapse and all sorts of other interesting things. Um, and so that little thing, you want to really pay attention to that sentence as you read through the rest of the dialogue to see if God interacts with things in the same manner at all times. Um, are the conclusions they coming to valid? I'll stop there before I go on to see if you want to respond to anything I've said so far.
Yeah, I think another reason why we have to assume he's responding as a Platonist in this is he says something, of course, base, which I believe. The deity cannot be seen merely by eyes, as other living beings can, but is discernible to the mind alone, as Plato says, and I believe him. So I think that concluding part of chapter 3 is sort of grounding the fact that he's answering this as a Platonist.
Got it. Yep. So I think that's how we'll treat it. And so uh, basically, I think my critique on this section then will be not from the perspective of critiquing a Christian, but I'd be critiquing Justin's views of Platonism versus the views of Platonism as I understand them. You know, is he giving Platonism a fair shake? So the next thing that I found really interesting is there's kind of a trilemma based on the quote you just said. So there are three things said here. A, what then? Is it in the same way we know of man and God as we have music, of math, arithmetic, astronomy in any other branch? So that's part A. So that's a question, right? Certainly not. So those two go together. So God is not known in the same way we know. I'm just going to pick on math to keep it easy, right? So God is not known in the same way we know math. But then in the part that you just quoted, which I labeled C, is it's discernible to the mind alone. So there seems to be kind of like a contradiction here in that he's saying that God isn't known the same way that, say, math is known, but also God is discernible to the mind alone. So either math is known through some way other than the mind, which I don't think Plato would have accepted, or God or the mind isn't sufficient to know God in the same way that Plato might think the mind is sufficient to know math. That's the first thing I found interesting.
Right. Let me look at that section here myself. For in all kinds of arts, he who knows any one of them is called a skillful man. In an art of generalship or of ruling or of healing equally, but in divine human affairs it is not so. Is there a knowledge which affords human understanding of human and divine things, and through acquaintance with? I think what he's saying there is that because those things are practical and quote unquote empirical,
Yeah,
men tend to readily acknowledge their value. Because one of the common things with Plato's dialogues in the mouth of Socrates is that philosophy is not valued.
right.
And the difference lies, okay, this is what I'm thinking, right? In that one, the valuation of those things is based on the fact that those things are actually physical things out there that you can see. God is not one of those things. And so when philosophers talk about God and the divine, they don't receive the same honors as those. But then here you said, what then is it the same as we know music and arithmetic? And then he says, no. But what's interesting here, he doesn't explain the no, right?
Right.
We don't know what that means any more than that, because he's setting up this event, but he's not giving us all the arguments. It's
Right.
it's interesting. There's certainly things that aren't spelled out.
And this is especially interesting because he's a Platonist, because for Platonists, more so than many other branches of philosophy, arithmetic is mental, because as we saw in the Phaedo, there is no true notion of equality out there in the empirical world. You'll never find two sticks of exactly equal length or two people of exactly equal height. Equality just doesn't exist, and so it has to be something fashioned by the mind. And so all the laws of arithmetic, geometry, and so on, which depend on equalities, like the Pythagorean theorem and such, they're all like true mental constructions of the forms proper and not merely derivable from the empirical world, which just can't contain the fundamental objects like plus and equals and so on.
Yeah, yeah. Again, that's. I think the ambiguity and difficulty here is just how that's incidental to the broader point Justin is making. Justin is trying to make another point,
It's
and
true, yes.
and he even says at the end of this whole discrete section, and there was a lot more that we talked about, but I won't bore you with the details.
Right.
So we already know that Justin is using this more for a device.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, my interest is less is what Justin's saying true and more um so what I'm looking at something like this, I'm hoping for like some meaty story about how a Platonist gets converted to Christianity, right? So the idea is there are ideas in Christianity that either fill in gaps in Platonism or overcome beliefs that he held as a Platonist or something like that. And so what I'm most concerned about is he representing the beliefs of Plato kind of accurately? Is he really a Platonist in this discussion? Um, and it turns out like based on this, that makes me doubt a little bit. The other interesting thing here that's missing is recollection, because Plato thought that you knew the gods the same way that you knew mathematics. In fact, he thought that when your soul died or when your body died, your soul went up to hang out with the gods and you'd come back and you'd have like some fleeting recollections and memories of what happened up there. And so true knowledge is just asking the right kinds of questions to remember what you should already have known. Um,
Well, actually, he does. There is a point where in the cross examination, something close to recollection gets dealt with. So I want to put that off until we get
oh,
there.
sure. Sure. It's just interesting that it wasn't there where it was like really relevant. Like, how do you know about God? Well, if you're a Platonist, recollection should be the first word out of your mouth, like,
Yeah. Okay. Chapter 4. Plato teaches that the mind's eye is of such a nature as to see God. Only the souls of men, not the souls of animals, see God. Animals and men both have souls, but of different kinds. Justin says a righteous soul shall see God, a soul that does no harm. The stranger argued that on this account, Justin should believe in innocent animals such as sheep and goats see God. Justin objects. Man sees God only when his soul is in the body. If a man is reincarnated and does not remember seeing God in a past life, what good is it to him? If a man reincarnated as an animal is not conscious of his punishment, what good is it? The soul of men do not transmigrate, but can see God if they are righteous and pious and honorable. Chapter 5, bring that up here. The soul cannot be immortal since it has a beginning. Only unbegotten things are immortal. Souls do not die, for then the sinner would escape judgment and get off lightly. The material world and the soul decays, God does not. The soul and God are unalike in this regard. And then 6, the stranger rejects the teachings of Pythagoras and Plato on the immortality of the soul. The soul does live, but is moved by something else and not self-moved. That which moves the soul is God. The life is an attribute innate in God, not innate in the soul. God gives it to the soul. The soul, when it leaves the body, goes back to where it came from. Okay, yeah, so going back to chapter 5, that's sort of where the whole, or 4 rather, is sort of where something close to reincarnation comes up and recollection, and you can start with there, Logos.
yeah, it's interesting that he kind of like denies it. So Plato in the Phaedo just embraced the idea that yeah, the souls go up to hang out with the gods and they learn all kinds of cool arithmetic and math and cool stuff, and they come down and they kind of remember the gods, which is why they have these ideas of them like Zeus or whatever, and they can worship them. It's also why we can know math just through asking the right questions and doing simple arguments. But he's just kind of like denying it. There are some things where if the soul leaves the body, they'd see and not remember. And so that's a real head scratcher. What do you do with a Platonist who denies recollection? Um,
Yeah, that's interesting.
right. So I mean, either he was taught by like a really odd sect of Platonists, or maybe he was never a Platonist, or I don't know. I'm not going to impugn too much. Um, what I did find very interesting is when he was talking about animals, right? The person talking with him says, animals, they do no harm. So what of them? That I was joking before the stream that that person might be a Socrates, but that seems almost like a Diogenes question, right? When Plato
Yeah.
was thinking, men are featherless bipeds. So he plucks a chicken, behold a man, and well, people who see God are the souls of those who haven't wronged others. And he'll just hold up a goat or something. Look, he hasn't wronged others. Look, he sees God. It seems like a very Diogenes thing to ask. Um, but aside from that, what interested me was when he said, "No, for their body being of such a nature is an obstacle to them." Now that is Platonist. That is the body is a prison. So there are certain types of things that can capture souls to keep them from seeing certain truths and knowledges. Now, where it gets interesting is he denies that this happens for men. He thinks that all people in the form of men, can see it, and he wants to say are ultimately responsible for figuring it out. But I'm not sure that's what Plato would have concluded in the Phaedo. As Plato says succinctly in the Phaedo, philosophy is the art of dying and staying dead because we're trapped in this cycle of moving from prison to prison, body to body, following these instincts, these raw emotions, these satiations we're always trying to get at. Um, and philosophy isn't the art of finding God, as Plato would say. God's secondary to that. Philosophy is the art of trying to escape that and figure out the true meanings of life and everything that's going on. It's not knowledge of what exists, but it's more like knowledge of ways of being that can kind of get you out of that cycle. It's almost quasi Buddhist in a really weird way. Um, and so for him to say that, well, humans, qua humans, just aren't going to have this problem, but animals will, seems to be trying to like have his cake and eat it with respect to what Plato said in the Phaedo. And so it's another interesting place where he kind of cross purposes with Platonism there.
Well, yeah, and now as an actual argument against reincarnation, for me personally, this interlocutor, whether he's imaginary or not, I do agree that a lot of these philosophies would say that if you are in the animal state, you don't know why you're an animal. You don't have see. That's kind of funny, right? If animals have souls but not rational souls, then how could a human reincarnated as an animal? Did he lose his rational soul? Did it go to sleep? Regardless, he doesn't know why he's there, so it's not like he can actually learn from that. I find that to be a compelling argument against that whole idea of death and rebirth in a cycle as such, whether or not that's an accurate description of Platonism. Yeah, the whole animal thing was funny. It definitely did strike me as something like a Diogenes or something. Um, the interesting thing was the objection in chapter 6 about the soul seems to be peripatetic, right? The unmoved mover. He's like, well, the unmoved mover doesn't move, so he's God, so he's immortal, but the soul moves. And even Plato, I forget which dialogue, says that the soul is like the harmony of a harp, that eventually that harmony can just go away. Or no, that was an objection that was raised to Plato.
Right.
And I forget Plato's answer to that, but Socrates' answer, I should say. But the idea was that the soul is not, well, that's the issue, right? Because a Platonist would say that the soul is this God spark, and that's why it doesn't fade away after the body dies. But um, Justin seems to think that the soul does perish after the body dies, in which case that would undercut the immortality of the soul. To be honest, especially in chapter 6, given the nature of the argument of this interlocutor, it sounds like Justin's more of a peripatetic and an Aristotelian, because Aristotle wouldn't believe the soul exists after the body.
Right. I got a lot of Aristotle vibes from this, but yeah, I want to go back to 5 because 5 and 6 are like meaty. I wrote like whole paragraphs of text that I wanted to go over, not my arguments, but just quoted blocks of the text that we need to like really dig into because there's a lot here. Um, so for 5, the part where it says, "You are right. For what reason has one for supposing that a body so solid, possessing resistance, composite, changeable, decaying, and renewed every day, has not arisen from some cause? But if the world is begotten, souls also are necessarily begotten, and perhaps at one time they were not in existence, for they were made on account of men and other living creatures. if you will say that they have been begotten wholly apart and not along with their respective bodies. So let's just start with that first paragraph. Um, this is where it got confusing, right? Because ostensibly he's supposed to be talking as a Platonist, but this sounded like he was trying to talk as a Christian when he says that souls are made for men, basically. It seems like he's trying to invoke there the biblical idea that God made you before you were born, or knew you were before you were born, and God kind of like makes your
Wait,
soul free your body.
real quick, Logos.
Yeah,
That's the interlocutor, not Justin speaking.
this is the interlocutor. Okay, that must have blurred. Interesting.
Because you can tell this. Look, he says, "Is it both begotten? Is it both unbegotten and immortal according to some who are styled Platonists?" So that's the interlocutor.
Right.
And then, do you say that the world is also unbegotten? So when it says some say so, I do not, however, agree with them. I think that's Justin. And then you are
Okay.
right. See, because it's a question and response, and Justin's the one answering the questions. So
Right.
I would
I guess
take
it
that.
also gets confusing because Justin didn't seem to argue against him. So when he says you're right, blah 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 blah, and Justin moves on, it sounds like they're both reaching a point of agreement.
Well, I think they are, but he's also using this device to explain how he became a Christian.
Right.
Yeah.
It's confusing, but I mean, let's just look at the argument, right, for this first paragraph. So the idea is, human bodies are composed, they're solid, they're decaying every day when we eat and whatever. Has not arisen from some cause, right? So that's true. So there are things about us that make us pretty sure that we're caused. Either we continue existing because we eat and do things, or we are born, whatever. Um, but if the world is begotten, souls are necessarily begotten. And so now we move on. Okay, so this is like I think the crucial inference. If the world is begotten, souls are necessarily begotten. Um, even if you take the weird Plato like the Timaeus, I don't know if that's true because you have something in there called the world soul. And the world soul could be like a proto-formal cause about like what the world is going to be like should it exist. The Timaeus even talks about the great craftsman who has blueprints of all the forms and how he's going to put them together, how the world's going to be made. And if the world soul is a juxtaposition of like all those different blueprints and how they're going to interact with each other, then surely the soul would preempt the existence of the world, and the soul could exist even if the world never did. So this is seeming to me to think of a soul as kind of like a hylomorphic or animating construct, and not in the Platonic sense. It's more of like a formal um, idea of like what a thing is intrinsically to be a thing. If it's the Platonic sense of a soul, then it has to exist before the world exists, and even if the world never exists at all. So that's kind of interesting.
Well, okay, two things, right? One, Origen, who was a Platonist, did believe in pre-existing souls, or at least speculated about that, which is consistent with a Neoplatonist upbringing. Again, I think Justin is actually a peripatetic. That sounds very Aristotelian.
Yeah. The more I read, the more I agree.
Now the question is, why would he then say that he was a Platonist? Is this a mistranslation that just happened over time? Because the actual arguments sound like the arguments of someone who believes in Aristotle's doctrine.
It does, especially as he transitions more and more and more to the idea that change requires a mover, which is a very Aristotelian line of thinking. Plato, especially in the Phaedo, emphasizes that flux is kind of eternal. It's things forever coming to be out of their opposites. So there's a coming to be born, there's a coming to die. Things that aren't on fire come to be on fire and come to be put out, and so on. And he just thought of life as a cycle of things always moving into the next thing, and not like some hard stop where there's nothing and then a something coming out of nothing. I mean, if there was a nothing something relationship in classic Platonism, it sounds like nothing to something to nothing to something to nothing, and somehow things always moving into the next stage. Like true stasis is impossible. Seems to be what he'd be going for.
Yeah, again, so I will say this again. This particular paragraph is the interlocutor speaking, but the
Right.
fact that it convinced Justin indicates that Justin's commitment to Platonism was weaker than his self, description might lead us to believe.
Yeah, the other interesting paragraph I found here was for this reason, souls both die and are punished, since if they were unbegotten, they would neither sin, nor be filled with folly, nor be cowardly, and again ferocious. nor would they willingly transform into swine and serpents and dogs, and it would not indeed be just to compel them, if they were unbegotten. For that which is unbegotten is similar to or equal to and the same with that which is unbegotten, and neither in power nor in honor should one be preferred to the other, and hence there are not many things which are unbegotten. For if there were some difference between them, you would not discover the cause of the difference, though you searched for it. But after letting the mind ever wander to infinity, you would at length weird out, take your stand on one unbegotten, and say, this is the cause of all. That again sounds very Aristotelian. I mean, if he wanted to quote the Phaedo, this is the last thing he would say, because the blueprints of the great craftsman will exist so long as the craftsman exists. They'd be just as eternal, unbegotten, and so on as the craftsman is. He pulls from the forms to kind of put things together. And yet nobody would say they have equal status to the craftsman. The difference between the craftsman and the forms is the ability to causally interact with stuff, right? There is forms and there is instantiation. So there's an unbegotten function by which forms can instantiate on flux to create structural matter. There is also the forms themselves, which are causally inert. So in Platonism, you have the natural distinction between those two classes of unbegotten things. This is also talked about in the Plato, where the Phaedo, where Plato's trying to grapple with what kind of thing the soul itself is. Remember, we talked with me and Andrew, where under the first argument, Plato thought the soul might be eternal because it was something in flux, always coming to be out of its opposite. This is where you get reincarnation, recollection. And the soul is kind of like a mind. It's a very active force, kind of like imprinting memories into the real world via the brain and things like that. The second argument for the soul, this was what you're talking about with the harp, right? So somebody interjected, like, well, there's this formal idea of the harp, but if you twing the string, eventually the note fades away. And then Plato was trying to say that the soul is the formal arrangement of the notes, not the twinging of the string. The soul is kind of like an arithmetic number. You don't go from 2 to 3. You don't go from an even number to an odd number. Those numbers exist in parallel. They don't come to be out of their opposites in the same way that physical things do. And so if you're trying to and so those are the two classes of unbegotten things: flux, causally efficacious things, and then not flux, just pure raw forms. And the craftsman is the kind of thing that through instantiation helps the two meet. And so we have this whole Platonic model for exactly how you can classify all these different kinds of unbegotten things, and tons of arguments from Plato about how to do that. And I think this is the interlocutor saying this again, but the fact that Justin kind of agrees with it is just kind of like really interesting, because this is completely different to Platonism.
Well, yeah, and if we look at okay, so beginning in chapter 6, he says, "It makes no matter to me," said he, "whether Plato or Pythagoras or, in short, any other man held such opinions." Okay, so that's the interlocutor speaking in chapter 6. Chapter 5, what you read, is Justin, which, yeah, that's not Plato, that's Aristotle.
Yeah.
So that's strange. It's strange. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Was there anything about chapter 6 you wanted to say?
Yeah, there was one thing that caught my eye that I thought was pretty interesting. The soul assuredly is or has life. If then it is life, it would cause something else and not itself to live, even as motion would move something else than itself. That's very Aristotelian. Now that the soul lives, no one would deny. But if it lives not as being life, but as the partaker of life. But that which partakes of anything is different from that of which it does partake. Now, the soul partakes of life since God wills it to live. Thus, then, it will not ever even partake of life when God does not will it to live. For to live is not its attribute, as it is God's. But as a man does not live always, and the soul is not forever conjoined with the body, since whenever this harmony must be broken up, the soul leaves the body and the man exists no longer. Even so, blah, 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 blah. I don't think I want to belabor that point too much longer. Um, that's an interesting argument. Um, the soul assuredly is or has life. Neither of these dichotomous ways of thinking about the soul are Platonic in the Phaedo, certainly. I've never heard Plato describe the soul um, this way either. Now, both as a Christian device. So a lot of this seems to be. So let's put off the side this question of Platonism, because I think we can both agree at this point that this isn't purely accurately Platonist, but this is more of a device, as we've alluded to several times, to kind of bring the audience in. So the audience should, I think the point of this is, what general philosophical precepts could both of us agree on despite our religious differences? You're a Christian, I'm a Jew. Here's some things about God, the soul, and so on that we can both kind of agree to. I think that seems to be the idea of both of these things. Neither of us will beg the question when talking about souls or whatever. Now, even looking at it in this way, it seems kind of strange from a Christian perspective, in trying to like level with the pagan about souls, because it seems like there's some things here that would be inconsistent with either Judaism or Christianity. And I kind of want to raise this to you. So when God says, like, he knows you before you're born, and you've got this idea where God like puts the soul, I don't know, in the body, so to speak. The two questions I have about that are, I mean, I don't think. Okay, here's the best way to entangle this. It seems like they're trying to struggle with the Greek notion that the soul is the animus. It's a thing that like makes life move. But they're also struggling with the Christian idea that like while the baby's developing in the womb and whatnot, right? God knows you like before you're born. So the soul is like God's idea of you that he kind of has even before your body is kind of like doing its thing. And so it doesn't have to be attached to an animating body. It's kind of like God's knowledge or blueprint of like what you as a person will be like.
Okay, yeah, I got it. Hold on.
Yeah.
Let me jump in here.
Yeah.
So I think probably the way I would understand that claim that God knows you before you're born, that David says you're fearfully and wonderfully made. Again, this is an analogy, but God knows the soul of the human in the sense that a craftsman knows the thing that he's making. It doesn't exist before he's made it. So, for example, say an earthenware vessel for some sort of temple duty, but he's the one who makes it, so he knows the form and the contours of this vessel. And I think in that way, God knows the human soul because he's that specific and meticulous in the making of each soul.
Right. So I think the question then is the soul God's idea of us before he makes us, or is the soul the animating thing put in the body?
Right. I don't think it's the idea in God's mind before he makes us. I think, well, given that Christians affirm that man has both a body and a soul, we could say at the quote, the point of conception, God is the one who's at that moment supplying the sort of, for lack of a better word, spiritual components that are that person's unique individual soul, along with the components of the mother and the father to make the body. And that whole, at that instant, it's being created, it's being molded and shaped in the way that a master craftsman would mold and shape an earthenware vessel.
Okay, in that case, yeah, that I didn't really understand how that worked, but if that's the case, it seems like then yes.
And the reason why I say this is Paul makes that explicitly clear in Romans. He says, "Can the pot say to the potter, 'Why have you made me thus?'"
Right. And so it seems like in the dichotomy, you'd have to say that the soul is being life sustained by something else.
Yeah, all of the existence itself in the Psalms is sustained by God's essence itself. There's forget the exact Bible verse, but it says if God were to withdraw back into himself, all creation would disappear.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That strikes me also now as very Christian. So I guess that makes a lot more sense. So I think that's everything I had for 1 through 6.
Cool. Going to 7. I'm just going to do the last 4 in one go, and then we can break it down later. The stranger tells Justin to read the prophets and trust them. They give no logical proofs or arguments. Their proofs are what they spoke of has happened and is happening. They in the past also performed miracles. The Spirit of God gave them knowledge. They all point to Christ. Okay, chapter 8. Justin jumps to the end of the conversation and says that after the stranger left, he gained a greater love for this Christ. He sought faith in Christ and sought to give it to others. Trypho approves of Justin's eagerness. He claims it would be better for Justin to have remained a Platonist than have become a Christian. For the former, in a state of rational living, might find favor with God. A Christian is self-condemned. He claims the prophesied Christ has not yet come, and the Christians have made up a Christ of their own out of a crucified carpenter. 9. Justin responds that Trypho is both deceived and unfamiliar with the prophets. Trypho's company laughs at this exchange. Justin walks away. Trypho stops him and sends away his rowdy companions. They withdraw to the Xystus. These companions that remain discuss the war in Judea. This is the Bar Kokhba War from 133 to 135. And one of the things why the not Justin, the interlocutor says that these things are still being fulfilled is the Jews have not yet been expelled from Palestine. The last major diaspora was with the defeat of the Jews in this war. And then chapter 10, oops, yeah, that was 9. 10, there we go. Justin asks if Trypho gives heed to the slanders given against the Christians. All the slanders we're familiar with from the Apology. Trypho says he does not care. He does not, for only the mob, people of no account, believe such tales. So he's not accepting the pagan criticism of the Christians. He's leveling his own Jewish criticism. Trypho says the Christians claim to follow the God of the prophets, but are not circumcised, do not keep the feasts and Sabbaths, do not change their mode of life after conversion. How can they please God when you break all his commands as handed down by Moses? So first of all, I think this was a natural stopping point, because then from this onward is going to be this dialogue about how to read the Old Testament, which is fascinating once we get into it. So from 7 to 10, do you have any thoughts on that, Logos?
No, I think that's where I jumped out of the more philosophical stuff that I felt I can grab onto and talk about, and started transitioning more into the Jewish Christian like inter-religious discussion that I don't know too much about.
Right, okay. Well, so we're going to go ahead and stop the screen share. We don't need that anymore. And so, yeah, this is setting up a lot of Christian arguments for how to read the Old Testament are going to be found in this dialogue, and they're still used to this day. So this is probably one of the most influential early Christian writings, because even if you don't know about Justin, even if you don't know about the dialogue with Trypho, you probably use a lot of his arguments when you interpret the Old Testament in light of Christ. And so he's extremely important in that regard. And again, this is one of the first father that we have a lot of material. You could say, I guess, Ignatius counts, but we've already gone over the difficulties with reading Ignatius, whereas with Justin, there's no obvious difficulties, and there's a lot to get through. But what's interesting, and this is the claim that I made before Ignatius, is we have a whole pattern of things that is kind of a smattering, because these are not really dense works that you can sort of chew on, where they sort of hint about the contours of Christian life. And I said that once we get to Justin and once we get to Irenaeus, we're going to see that they're going to go deep, but it's going to be going deep in a way that's consistent with all the prior patterns. So the kind of reading of those patterns that I was giving the audience, say from Clement of Rome all the way up to Ignatius, was one way, and is as we finish the first and second apology and have begun to dig into the dialogue with Trypho, we see, well, of course, foreshadowing, I already knew because I read this stuff years ago, but the point is, though, that's an accurate summary of those early beliefs, because in more detail they're fleshed out by, say, Justin and Irenaeus and then other fathers later on, but it's not inconsistent. And so you could sort of view those early epistles as a sort of like thumbnail sketch of Christian living. And I think the reason why we don't have more is there was heavy persecution. Nero, Domitian. We have a bit of a break in persecution from Domitian really all the way up till Decius in 250. So we got like 150, 160 years where Christians are more or less left alone and can actually start to write. And plus there's now more Christians. So any thoughts on that, Logos?
Nope. I look forward to seeing more.
All right, everyone. This is Tyler Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing off. Good night.